Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. This is Fahim Niaz. I am the product manager for Anime Studio. This is lesson 4, the last lesson of our free 4-part webinar training series that will take you through the steps of creating a basic animation project using Anime Studio. Chad Troftgruben of Incredible Tutorials will be presenting the series. Chad is an expert on creating tutorials and is an avid animator who has in-depth knowledge of Anime Studio. His tutorials have been viewed by thousands, so we're very pleased to have him here. Michi Katniss is our moderator. In this session, Chad will show you how to create the actual animation. So just so everyone knows, all attendees will be muted. We will be taking many questions in this particular webinar. We have an extended Q&A, so please make sure to type in all your questions and comments and what have you in the Q&A window that should be located at the bottom of the series of windows that are allocated to you. So let's get this started, and we'll pass the ball over to Chad.
Okay, thank you very much, Fahim. So to get started, we will begin today's lesson by, of course, opening up Anime Studio. So once you have that program open, what we want to do is open up the file that we created last week when we were creating the bone animation for our character. So to do this, all you have to do is go to File and Open, and then locate that character in whatever folder you may have put him or her into. So in this case, I have him right here, and I'll just double click to open him up. So now I have the character on screen, and I want to just point a couple of things out, because I know last week, if you watched last week's webinar, I was having some issue with the bone animation. Well, as you can see, if I take my Translate Bone tool here, or my Manipulate Bones tool, excuse me, and I move the limbs, you can see that I have fixed it. Ta-da! I just wanted to point out the main reason why this was fixed between last week's lesson and this week's lesson is because I used the patch layer, which was something I was not using in last week's lesson because I wanted to make it a bit more universal for our debut users out there. But just to demonstrate, when I zoom in here on this limb, if I come over here to the layers panel on my right, you'll see that I have a layer right here that looks like a little patch. Well, if I hide that, you can see that we have that line come in, and we also have a little bit of a bump here that it wasn't visible before, and we can hide all that. And the same applies to, of course, the other arm and the legs as well. But again, I just want to show that the patch layer can very easily patch things up if you're having issues. And of course, I did some other tweaks as well to make it fit, but I just want to point that out and show you that it is doable, even if I couldn't quite get there last week. So now to get started with today's lesson, the actual lesson itself, what I first want to do is bring this character into Anime Studio's library. And the advantage to doing this is that you can essentially store characters, objects, animations, whatever, into a universal library that can be accessed from any one of your project files. So to do this, I will go to Window, which is right at the top here, and Library. Now your library will load up, and again, your library has all sorts of stuff. You'll see that you have numerous sections: my characters, new characters, partners. Actually, I think my characters is mine, but my own creation. But again, you'll have all sorts of different folders here. So what we can do is we can locate a folder where we want to put this character into, let's say this folder right here, and with the character layer, our bone character layer selected on the right layers panel, all you have to do is hit the plus sign down here called Save Character, and you'll notice now that my character has appeared right into that folder. And that's all you need to do. That means this character has now been saved in the library. And just for further clarification, if you ever need to do anything more with these files, you can always go to Windows Explorer or Finder if you're on a Mac. And in this case, on Windows, it's in My Documents, Smith Micro, Anime Studio Pro, version 8, library. And in my characters folder, I have the My Characters folder that I made myself, and I have my character right there. And as you can see, it's just simply an Anime Studio document. So if at any time you need to arrange folders, move things around, this is another easier way you can do it as well. And I'm not sure why I have an audio file folder in there. That probably shouldn't be there. So I'll probably get rid of that at some point here. But anyway, once you've done that, I'll just pop over back here to Anime Studio, and you have now your character in the library. We are now going to open up the environment that we made in Lesson 2. So let's go to File, Open, and now I'll select that environment I made in Lesson 2. So just locate that and then double click on it. And we now should have a familiar looking picture here as far as the environment is concerned. So next, we want to bring that character we just saved into this environment. So if your library is still open, and if it's not, just go to Window, Library. We'll locate that character, and then all you have to do is click on the double check mark icon right here. It's called Add Character. Once you do that, your character will now be imported into the project file. And you'll see that you have your layer. That was just how you had it in that project file brought over, and everything is there. So that's a really cool way to do this. And you could go into any project file. You can make a new document. You can open up an existing document, and you can bring that character in. It's a really cool feature. So I'm just going to close out of that right now so we can see more of our screen. So now, the next step is going to be to animate this character out. First, though, I should probably bring him below this tree layer, though, because he's not supposed to be there. He should be behind the tree. So I'll just downsize this layer here since it's open. I don't need to see all the sub-layers on my character layer anymore, so I can just click this arrow to just downsize that. And now, on your right layers panel, all you have to do is hold, then drag your character below the tree. As you can see, your character is now behind the tree. And that is exactly what we want. So we're now going to focus in on the timeline. We're going to actually just create the character walking from left to right. It's a very simple animation, but it'll give you a head start on creating this process and building your knowledge in Anime Studio. So when on the timeline, which is your area down here with all of these numbers, the timeline essentially maps out your animation. And it's done with keyframes. Now, it might be kind of confusing, the word keyframe. What does it mean? Well, essentially, I think the best way to understand what a keyframe is it's a change on the timeline. So whenever you see a keyframe, you're changing something on the timeline. The good thing about Anime Studio is between the keyframes that you create, an animation will be animated out automatically. So let's demonstrate what I mean here. So first, I want to hide this tree that we put in front of our character just so we can kind of see him a bit easier here. So we'll go like that. Now, on the timeline, we want to advance one frame forward so that we're on frame 1. So just like that, you can use your arrow key on your keyboard, the right arrow key, just to page forward. You can also type in the number right here if you wish, or you can click and drag this little red meter right here to put yourself where you want on the timeline. So now, we want to be in frame 1 because as I talked to you in lesson, I believe it was 3, the frame 0 is actually pretty much a work area. It has nothing to do with your animation. So on frame 1, we want to set up our character to be in a certain position. So let's first use the Translate Layer tool to do this. So I'll just click on my Translate Layer tool on my left toolbar, and I will move him off the screen to the left. So I'll just click and drag him over like this. So he is now over there. And we could put him over there on frame 0 as well, but I always kind of like to make sure, same on frame 0, I always like to make sure that he's over at least on frame 1. But you could do it on frame 0 as well, even though frame 1 is the one that matters. But anyway, once we have done that, we want to put our character so that he goes all the way across the screen. And this is very easily done. Let's page over to about frame 72 on the timeline, or about 3 seconds in. The 72 indicates the frame, the 3 indicates the seconds. And this will change depending on your frame rate, which I think I discussed in a question in lesson 1, or lesson 2. But we will advance to frame 72, take the Translate Layer tool, and simply just click and drag him over like this. You'll see, it's kind of hard to see because of the sky and the colors we have. I have a line that goes from here all the way to here. And that's indicating that our character is moving from point A to point B. Or, as you can see on the timeline, from this circle to this circle. Or in other words, from keyframe to keyframe. So basically, we created a change from here to here. Because again, keyframes indicate change. So, if we page back now through our timeline, you'll see though that the character now animates between those frames. This is called tweening. It's basically an in-between animation. So, if we were just to go to frame 1 and hit the play button on our document here, you can see that he goes all the way across the screen. Now, of course, we don't want to just end it there because he needs to do a walking animation. Unless if you're doing something like South Park, we might want to be a little bit more involved with this process. So let's go back to frame 1, and let's create a starting motion for our walking animation. So I will just grab the Manipulate Bones tool that's on the left toolbar, and of course making sure that you're still on the character bone layer. We will simply come over here and bring this leg up like this. And then we'll bring this leg over like this. And then from here, I can move this hand slightly and that hand slightly back. Maybe you just tilt the torso forward just slightly, and maybe just put the head back a little bit like that just to give it some different movement. So now, if we page forward, he's in that position because we created 2 keyframes, as you can see, for the bone layer now. We created a change on the timeline, so we have those keyframes. And you can always easily tell what's going on here. For instance, this icon right here, the layer translation, as it appears, as it highlights over, you can see it, that text appears, looks very much like the Translate Layer tool on your left toolbar. So that means that this right here controls the movement of your layer. The bones, of course, select the selected bone angle, and the bone angle control your bone keyframes. So that's always very easy to look at when you're just glancing at your timeline. So now, let's page forward to about, let's say, frame 15. Now I want to move my legs in the opposite directions to continue on with the walking animation. So I can just bring my leg like this, and bring that leg like that, move this hand back, move this one forward, and I can kind of go up like this and go like that. So now we have the walking animation going like that. Now we need to do one more thing. We need to complete it because, of course, he moves his legs forward, but they need to go backward again. Now, there is a way to create a looping animation for this, which is what I'm going to show you. So essentially, we can have this character walk all the way across the screen with his legs moving without the needed work to create more keyframes. We can actually just copy those keyframes and we can create a looping animation. And I believe this was a question that was asked in one of the lessons about a looping background animation. And this is essentially the same concept. So what we want to do is go to about frame 30 on our timeline, And to easily complete this animation and ensure that the looping animation is going to be not glitchy, we can click and drag to select frame 1's 2 bone keyframes. And when you do this, the keyframes will highlight in red. And once you've done that, click the copy button, and then click the paste button on your timeline. You'll see now that all those bone movements reverted back to the first frames. So the walking animation now completes, just like that. But of course, he keeps going and sliding like this. As I said, we can manually continue to just move the the legs every few frames, which you can do if you want, or we can right-click on the top bone keyframe on frame 30 and choose Cycle. A dialog box will appear asking you if you want to do absolute or relative. Choose absolute and keep the value at 1 because we're indicating we want to cycle back to frame 1, and click OK. You'll now see a red arrow goes all the way back to frame 1 for both of these bone animations. So now, as we cycle through this, you can see that he just keeps walking forever and ever and ever, even when he's off the screen. So that is an advantage to cycling your keyframes. And you can do the manual thing, but especially if you have, let's say, an extended looping animation where you want it to just be done with and you want it to look correct, you don't want to have much variation in the walk, you can always do this type of thing where it comes to cycling the animation. So now, there is one more thing we can do, and I can show you here before we move on. You'll notice when I hit play, the character kind of slows up. He starts slow, and then he speeds up, and then when he comes to the end of his animation, he slows down. This is the default way that Anime Studio animates out the movements of your keyframes. You can switch this very easily, and sometimes you may not want that slow to fast to slow animation, because let's say you're doing a shot of a speeding car driving by the camera. You may not want to go from slow to fast to slow. You may just want it to be a consistent speed. Well, to do that, all you have to do is right-click on your first keyframe you want to change this for and choose linear. Now, there's all sorts of different ones too, like the ease in and out. The smooth is what's the default to. Ease in and out kind of does what I said a bit more, just a bit more pronounced. Ease in just does just one or the other, depending on ease in and out, if you want to do the slow to fast and all that. So let's just choose linear. And you can see now that that keyframe has a line going through it, indicating that it's now linear. And now you'll see that he just walks across the screen with no change in speed. It's just a consistent speed. And I use smooth a lot, but sometimes you just may want to have it linear. So that's something you can do when working on your animations. So now let's move on to importing that second character into this environment that I mentioned that you may want to create in the first lesson. We created the character here, and I said you should create a second character just so you have something else to work with as we work on this project. And if you don't have a second character, it's not a huge deal. It's just something else I'm going to show you here. So first, I'm just going to go back to frame 0 on my timeline, just so I don't mess with anything else on the timeline. It's always a safe bet to be at frame 0 before you make any design changes when it comes to drawing or importing. And once you have done that, we can use the library feature that I showed you, or there's another way to import objects into your environment. And that is to go to File, Import, Anime Studio Object. From here, I already have my second character set up, and all you have to do is double-click on the file that you want to import. And now I have brought in a second character, and hey, look at that, it's Steve from Steve and the Alien. That's not a plug or anything. So, okay, anyway, you now have your second character in the environment. And for this, I'm just going to do something really simple. I'm just going to put him behind the fence, and I'm going to have him waving. And I'll just basically just go over the steps again I showed you with creating an animation. I'll just do it a little bit quicker, but just so you can see it one more time. So I'll take the Steve character, and I'm going to put him below the fence group layer. So I'll just click and drag to put him right below that group layer. And I will take my scale layer tool, which is on my layers panel, and just hold in shift to make sure I'm proportionately scaling this layer and just shrink him down like this. And then I can, of course, nudge him up with my translate layer tool like that. And yeah, that's about right. He might be he's kind of a tall character, but I might shrink him down just a little bit more and put him right about there. Okay, so we now have that character right there, and I will create an animation for him as well. So I will go to frame 1 on my timeline, and I can just zoom in here really quick, and I can grab my manipulate bones tool, and I can put his hand up like this. I'm just going to have him waving to the audience because, yeah, he's a friendly guy. He's smiling, and yeah, he's cool. So we will go to about, let's say, frame 18, and I can just move my bone like that. And then I'll go to about frame 36, and just like before, of course I could do this manually, but I'll just cycle the animation. So I'll just highlight those 2 keyframes and then copy that, and then paste those 2 keyframes onto frame 36. And then finally, I can just right-click on that top bone and choose Cycle. Make sure it's absolute and choose the value of 1 and click OK. So now he'll be waving forever. Oh, his eyes closed. That is because I have a switch layer in play, and I can actually show you that really quick. Switch layers, and I do have more detailed tutorials on this, but switch layers essentially allow you to switch from one layer to another. This is great for, let's say, mouth movements or for an eye to close and open. And I must not have cleared that keyframe out of my switch layer before I imported this in, but I'll open up that second character just to show you briefly what switch layers really do. You'll see I have an eyes switch layer right here, and you can indicate that with that yellow folder with the arrow going up. And when I click on that switch layer, you'll notice that I switch my timeline to a new timeline. Every single layer that you have on your project has its own timeline. This is actually a really good lesson to teach because it's important that you understand that. So like if I do something on this timeline for the eyes switch layer, and let's say I go back to the mouth switch layer, you'll see that there's no keyframes on the mouth switch layer. So it's very important to understand that the timeline is very dependent on which layer you're currently on. So if you're looking for a keyframe that you swore that you put down, you have to make sure that you're on the right layer. That happens to me a lot. Can get kind of confusing when you have a bunch of layers and you're working on a complicated project. But anyway, going back to the eye switch layer, you'll notice that at frame 24 I have a keyframe, and that's when his eyes close. Well, that's because underneath the switch layer I have 2 instances of my eyes. I have the closed and I have the open. Well, we want to keep them open. So going back to that eye switch layer, we can either delete this keyframe, or we could just kind of go with this and just right click on that eye switch layer and just choose the open instance of the eyes. So essentially whatever you put under the eye switch layer will be able to be selected and be put onto the stage at any given time. And I'm not going to go into it too much further because I actually didn't plan on that portion of my eyes closing. However, I do have a few different tutorials actually on switch layers in both the Steve and the Alien tutorial series and just standalone tutorials on switch layers. So I definitely recommend you check those out if you're interested in them, especially the mouth syncing tutorial that I have created that really goes into depth with it. But anyway, going back now to our camera movements and our animations, we can see that the character waves as our other character walks by. So that now completes that character's animation. And so we can move on now to using the camera. So Anime Studio comes built in with a camera system that basically allows you to zoom, to track, to rotate, and even do sort of a 3D effect all within the animation. And it's actually really cool to use. And you'll remember that in the second lesson, I put some things into the background. Like I used the Z, when I went to the Translate Layer tool, we used that Z option to push things into the background. And what's cool here is when we start using the camera movements, you'll see that the camera reacts to how these things are in the background. The hills will move slower with the camera pans than that of the foreground because they are in the background, and that's just kind of how things go. So let's go back to frame 0 just to make sure that we are in our safe zone here so we don't mess with the timeline. And now let's just advance to frame 1. And you'll notice on your left toolbar that you have a camera section. You have the track camera, zoom, roll, and tilt. So let's click on the track camera. And I'm simply just going to click once on the project file to create a keyframe because I want a starting point for this. You always want a starting keyframe before you create an ending keyframe, or else there'll be nothing to keyframe or animate. So make sure you always have that starting keyframe. And you'll notice, just like all the other layers, you have your camera tracking keyframes independent of everything else on your timeline. So that's another thing to mention too. I mentioned that each layer has its own timeline. There are some instances where that is different. In the case of the camera, would be a good option. Would be a good example of that because the camera layer will always appear on your timeline, no matter which layer you click on. So I'm on my mouse switch layer. You see that the camera is there. I go back to my character bone animation. I have, of course, the bone animation, my translate layer animation, and I have, of course, the camera layer right there. So that's just something to keep in mind also when working with different timelines and layers. So we have the character move. So let's have the camera track with him. So he ends his animation at about 72 frames. So let's just follow along with him. We'll just take the track camera and move it like this to track along with him. Now, of course, you can see that there's a problem with this already in that as I track the camera, my land disappears because I didn't create the land to be long enough for this tracking. But we'll fix that in a little bit here. So as we page back, you can see now that the camera tracks with the character. It's not 100%. He's a little bit off there, and he kind of comes more center as he comes along, which is just fine. That's how you want it to look. But you also have the same options you do with any keyframe. For instance, if you right-click on that track camera keyframe and choose linear, your camera will now just go at a consistent pace as opposed to doing the slow to fast, down the slow movement again. So that's something you can check out as well. And finally, we could do a zoom animation of the camera, but first, let's actually extend out this environment. Because as I said, when we get to this point, it looks like he's going to walk off the end of the earth, and that's not a good thing. So let's come back here to frame 0, because remember, whenever you're working on an animation, if you need to make a correction, if you need to add something like a drawing, you must be on frame 0 by default in Anime Studio because that is your work area, that's your safe zone. So once you're there, let's come in here to our layers panel. I'll make sure I downsize the Steve layer here. And I will choose the ground to start with. Once I have that highlighted, I can come over here to my left tool panel and choose the Scale Points tool, or you can choose the Scale Layer tool. I'll choose the Scale Points tool for this demonstration because I have everything highlighted already for that. And I'll just simply click on this middle right panel here, and I'll just move it over like this. I'm extending it out this way as well, but that's okay. That'll give us some room to work with if we ever want to pan that way as well. So now, just to check, if I jump to 72, we still have plenty of ground to work with. So that is a sufficient amount of space for this pan. Now I'll shoot back to frame 0, and I will grab now the road group layer. And actually, I can go into that road group layer just by hitting that arrow. And I will choose the road itself. and choose the Scale Points tool again from our left toolbar. And I'll just bring it out like this. And for the road details, how about we do this? I will just click on that road details layer, hold in Control, and hit the A button. Or alternatively, you can go to Edit, Select All. This will select all the details you have on the road, and then we can go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste. Now taking your Translate Points tool, we can just, oops, I didn't want to do that. We can just move all these points, if I can grab them, over. Oh, that's not good. Okay, well what we can do then is, instead of doing that, since that's giving me an issue, this is another way you can do this as well. Sometimes if you have little points like that, I should have paid attention to that before I did this. It can be hard to grab them all. So I'll just simply hit my delete key to delete those. And we'll just duplicate the layer. It's pretty much the same thing. So I'll just click on the duplicate layer option on my layers panel to duplicate those road details. And then simply take my translate layer tool and move them over like that. I should have done that in the first place because it was a lot simpler to explain than what I was trying to do there. But anyway, so now you have the road details over. And finally, we just need to extend the fence and the hills. So very quickly here, I can come over here to my fence group and just duplicate that. And then take my translate layer tool and just move it over like this. Now, this looks a little bit awkward right here with these two posts. So all I would have to do is go into that second fence group I just made, click on my vertical posts layer, and then take the Select Points tool on my left toolbar and just highlight like this and hit the delete key on your keyboard. And then if we want to, we can move the second fence group below the first so that we have this issue solved with this overlapping horizontal post, just like that. And then finally for the hills, I'll just duplicate that layer as well. So I'll click on the hills, click the duplicate layer, and then take my translate layer and just move it over like this. Now, of course, you could manually create hills and more of a fence and all that kind of stuff, which is something you may want to do if you want more variety in your environment. For this particular demonstration, given the time constraints, I'm just doing the copy-paste method. But again, feel free to play with all of that at your leisure. So now, when we have the camera pan, we have more of an environment, and that works out. So now we have him not walking off the ends of the earth. One more thing I noticed too, and I must have done this when I was creating my environment last time, the clouds are actually not set in the background. You'll notice as I'm moving, the clouds are moving just at the same pace of the foreground objects. So I'll just fix this very quick by going back to frame 0, clicking on my clouds layer, and then coming up here to your top portion where you have all your options for your layers, and we'll put -6 for the Z, and just hit enter. That of course shrinks your clouds, and you'll probably remember this from the second lesson. But all we have to do then is take the scale layer tool on our left toolbar, hold in shift, and enlarge the clouds like that to bring them back. So now when we page through, you'll see that the clouds are in the background and they don't move as fast as the foreground objects, which looks a lot better in my opinion. So now finally, as I said, if you want to play with other camera movements, you can. For instance, if we click on frame 1 and then go back to our left toolbar and click on the zoom camera tool and just click to create a keyframe, because remember we need one keyframe to keyframe the other. And if we just move all the way, let's say to frame 72, we can just use the zoom in camera tool to zoom in. And of course, he's still a little bit high up now, according to the project boundaries. So we can just take that track camera movement and just nudge it down like this, which is okay because we're on that keyframe anyway. So all we're doing is adjusting the keyframe. And now you'll see that it zooms in as he walks. So I'm not sure if that's something you'd like to do, but it's of course an option for you. And of course, I can right-click to choose a linear movement for that zoom if I wish. So you can see that the animation zooms in as it tracks. And finally, you can play with the other two camera options on your own time. They have their uses, the roll camera and the pan and tilt camera. They can do some kind of cool effects. So I definitely recommend you check those out if you have the time to do so on your own. So now we have an animation set out here. It might not be the best animation, but for 35 minutes into our lesson, I think it's a pretty good animation. So what we can do now is export this out. Which means we're essentially going to create a video for this project, because let's just pretend that we're done and it's the best thing ever. We want to share this to the world so that you can become a billionaire and then live the rest of your days in a mansion because you created the best cartoon ever. So the first thing I want to point out, and this is one last timeline note, is that by default, when you open up or start a new project file, I should say, you're typically going to have your animation run to be 240 frames. And you can see this because it says right now 0 of 240. That 240 is the end of your animation. And if I scroll my timeline here, you'll see that I have a purple shade on my frames up until 240. That means anything between 0 and 240 will be animated out when you export. So that even means, even though I ended at 72 frames, it will export all this dead space out of him walking in like just a standard motion, a still motion like that, up until 240, which is not something we want. Alternatively, let's say you have a 1,000 frame animation. You're going to want to make sure that everything past this is counted in your export. So just make sure that you indicate how many frames your animation is before you export the animation. So in this case, as I said, the animation is 72 frames. So all you have to do is come over here to the of portion and just type in 72 and hit enter. So now you have only 72 frames of animation that will be exported out. So now that you're all done, first make sure you go to File and Save, because you want to save your project file, because it's always good to keep your project files. You never know what's going to happen. Something could mess up. You might want to change something. It's always good to have those template files on hand. Now once you've done that, you go to File and Export Animation. Here you'll have a bunch of different options to create your video. First, you have the start and end frames like you did what I just showed you on that bottom portion. So you could change it here as well. If you click Entire Animation, you're going to select what you indicated down here. So it'll go from 1 to, of course, 72. For the output format, this is the most important part, at least it is for me. You have, of course, a series of options. You can choose JPEG, bitmap. You can do Photoshop files and 2 different types of video files, and Flash files. For this particular demonstration, I wanted to do a video file. That way I can upload it to YouTube or Facebook, or I can burn it to a DVD, whichever you want to do. Now, in my opinion, QuickTime is the best way to go for the video format. AVI doesn't, and this is not just for Anime Studio, it's kind of just in general. I don't really like AVI video files all that much. They're usually really bloated, and sometimes I just have issues with how they export. So I would definitely choose QuickTime for this if you have the option. Just make sure you have your QuickTime components installed on your computer. If you're on a Mac, you'll definitely have that option before you can, of course, output that out. Just make sure you have QuickTime installed. So you have some other options here, and typically I would leave these as is because I would want you to get the best quality of your export as possible. So you want to leave the first option checked. Apply shape effects. Those are the effects that you would apply with your style panel. Of course, if you have any of those, you want to leave those checked. Same with the layer effects. You probably don't want to reduce your animation to half dimensions, half frame rates. Those are useful if you want to test out an animation, and you don't want to spend a lot of time rendering out just to see what it looks like. So you could use those if you wanted to test. And everything else, I would probably just leave as is, just so you get the best possible looking animation. So once you've done that, click OK, And now you'll be prompted to save this where you want to save it. So choose a folder that you know you'll want to save it in, and you can just now name it. I'm just going to put a test name here really quick and just hit save once you have that. And now you'll be brought to one more screen. Of course, there's all these screens for exporting. It might seem confusing at first, but really once you get it, it really isn't that bad. So depending on what you picked, if you picked AVI or if you picked QuickTime, you're going to have different compression types. For me, I have these compression types for my QuickTime format. Now, this is important because the compression basically dictates how your video will look. It's how it's going to compress the video. For instance, there might be some codecs that don't work as good for animation, and so you might get like a pixelized look to maybe some of the movement. That's actually happened to me a couple of times when I use some different codecs. Also, the colors can change depending on your codec, and there's all sorts of different variables. Also, it also depends on how big you want to make it and so on. So what I recommend, and there's a lot of people who actually disagree with this, but I recommend you choose the animation compression type because typically I have the best results with that one. If that one doesn't work for you, my second option would be H.264. H.264 isn't my first choice, mainly because it tends to wash the colors out a little bit when you export it. Now, when I export my final product for the internet, after I put it into my video editing software, I then put it to H.264. It just seems to work better for me. You do have bigger file sizes with the animation codec, but that's just the workflow I have chosen. And of course, you can choose your own. You can follow my advice. You can throw it away. You can do whatever you want. I'm just kind of giving you a template for what I do. So your frames per second, you're going to want to match that with the frames per second you chose for your project file, which in this case for me it's 24. For your depth, you're probably going to want to choose millions of colors or millions of colors plus, because that's going to give you, of course, the best possible picture as well as putting it to best for the quality. So once you've done all that, you click OK, and it's going to render out. Now, I'm not going to do this myself because I want to save some time. Rendering can take anywhere from a minute to hours. It really depends on the length of your animation, and it depends on the effects and the layers you have in your animation. For instance, the more blur effects, the more camera perspective effects, the more assets you have in the background, the longer it will take. The other day I was working on a cartoon, and I had some of that camera perspective stuff going on. I had quite a few layers in the background, and it was an 800 frame animation, and it took an hour to render out. So those are just some considerations to keep in mind when you are getting to the rendering process. So that'll render out, and it might take a little bit of time. I'm just going to cancel out of that. But once you have rendered out your project, you're now going to want to bring it into a video editing software. This is how you're going to piece all of your scenes together. What we created here was just one scene. What I recommend you do, if you have a longer movie, is you create separate project files for your scenes, because that will allow you to organize, and you can then piece it all together in your video editing software, and then you can, of course, do little tweaks here and there as well. So I'll briefly show you how that process goes. I'm going to open up Adobe Premiere. This is the video editing software that I prefer. It's probably not for everyone because, of course, there is the money factor. It does cost quite a bit. Unless if you get it in a bundle, then it actually kind of benefits you because you can get After Effects, which also you can use in conjunction with your animation if you wish. But I would recommend that if you are on a budget to look on your computer, because if you're on Windows, you'll have a software called Windows Live Movie Maker. And if you're on a Mac, you'll have iMovie. These two programs will allow you to edit videos in a basic way, but you'll be able to get by with it. And it's all free to you because you already have it on your computer. But the process will be very similar if you are using those softwares or any other type of video editing software. I'll have my project here, and I have basically my folder here for where I'm going to put my stuff. And I'll just go to File and Import to bring in that video file that I just made. Plus, I'm going to bring in another. And I did these before we did the webinar just to save some time. I exported these out. So I'm going to select those two video files, and I'm going to bring them in to my software here. So now I have a timeline right down here, just like I would in Anime Studio. It looks different, of course, but all I have to do is just click and drag to put my first clip in, which of course has my character walking, as you can see. And I'll bring in another clip. Let's put it in like that. So now, as you can see, these clips are back to back. And so we have the character walking. It's a nice sunny day. He just doesn't have a care in the world. Meanwhile, in outer space, a UFO comes down and it's probably going to kill him. Okay, so that might not be exactly what your cartoon's going to be like, but you kind of get the idea. You're going to have your separate scenes put together. They're going to be done in separate project files in Anime Studio, and then you can meld them together in a video editing software. And the advantage here then is, let's say you want, I don't want this to go so long. I want this to end sooner. He walks too long. Well, I can just, like that, just clip it off and then drag this over, and I've just shortened the scene. So there are obviously advantages to doing this video editing portion, and this is where I do most of the audio work as well. I'll import audio into Anime Studio when doing the voices, so I can sync up the mouths. But when it comes to music, when it comes to sound effects, I usually do it in the video editing software. While you can do it in Anime Studio, since my project files tend to be bigger, it's just easier for me to do it all after the fact. So that is just something you can play around with as well, and you can check out all those different aspects to the video editing portion. And of course, once you've done with that, you can export it out through your video editing software, and then you can upload it to YouTube, Facebook, or whatever you want to do. So anyway, to conclude with all this, I just wanted to say that what I have done here doesn't even scratch the surface of what you can do in Anime Studio. This is very, very, very basic stuff. And you can easily tell that when you go out on the internet. There are some incredibly talented artists out there who use Anime Studio, who create studio quality work. And it really all comes down to how much time you want to put into it. And that's really all it is. I mean, as much dedication you can put into your cartoon, you'll get a better product. And I think, you know, with these tools I have given you, I hope at least you'll be able to get a jump start on that. And if you need any more help than what these webinars have provided, I highly encourage you to check out tutorials online. Although it's a shameless plug, I have plenty of tutorials on Anime Studio at incredibletutorials.com. I have my new Stephen the Alien tutorial series up that goes very in-depth with all this stuff. And so you should definitely check those things out on YouTube and my website. And I just encourage you guys to continue working. I mean, don't give up. It can be discouraging. It's an overwhelming process. But if you keep going with it, I am very sure you'll eventually have fun with it, and I'm sure you'll be able to create some amazing work. So I thank you guys for watching, and I'll now take some questions.
Thank you very much, Chad. While we ask our participants to fire away with their questions, they may do so regarding any of the webinars that we have discussed in the last 4 weeks. I'd like you to show your YouTube site and your web page, if possible, the Incredible Tutorials, so that we could see it.
Right, I forgot to bring that up. Okay, yeah, I'll bring it up right now. This is my website, Incredible Tutorials, and again, the address is just incredibletutorials.com. And what we have here, it's pretty easy to navigate. You'll probably want to go right to the Anime Studio section when you get there. And from there, you can choose all sorts of different tutorials. You can see right now I have the Stephen the Alien series pretty much dominating the category, because that's my new set of tutorials. But from there, you can just, let's say, click on a video, and you have some information down here, and all you have to do is hit play, and you can play the video out. It's actually pretty cool, and you can leave comments and questions right there. And of course, you can also go to my YouTube channel. You could actually really do that just by clicking on that title of that video, and you could ask questions there as well as you wish. So that is incredibletutorials.com.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So let's get to some of these questions. So the first question, Chad, is if you save a character to the library that originally has actions or animations, would the library be able to keep those animations?
Yes, because you're essentially you're saving, for instance, if you save a bone animation, you're essentially saving all that animation. The other thing you can do too, though, I didn't bring it up when I was doing this, is there is an actions panel, which I'd recommend you use more than that of the library, because not for saving characters, but for saving actions, because you can actually combine actions and you can save them, and you can do all sorts of stuff with the actions panel. And I actually have a tutorial on that, and I just couldn't get to that in this short amount of time. So,
okay, thank you. When making animation loops, is there a way to define a point on the timeline when the loop should stop?
Yes. But basically, when you saw me doing the cycle end, here, let me go back to that project file I was using. Actually, wait a minute. I actually have it right here. What am I thinking? Anyway, you'll see right here, you see the arrow going, and then it stops, and it loops back. You're basically defining right there, that's where you want the animation to stop. That's where you want it to end on the loop. Now, if you're talking about as far as ending it from this point on, like if he keeps going and going and going, if that's what the user is asking, I believe you can just break the cycle by creating another keyframe. So you could just create another keyframe, and I believe that would break the cycle then of animation. Yep, that'll break the cycle of animation. So that's all you would have to do, is you loop it as long as you want, and then you create another keyframe, and you can stop the animation just like that.
Okay, thank you. So Chad, do you ever export to Flash, and if you can provide some commentary on that?
You know, I really don't anymore. I used to use Adobe Flash itself back a couple of years ago, more for my personal work. And well, back before YouTube, Flash was a big thing. Exporting SWFs, embedding it onto web pages. You know, places like Newgrounds, they still do that stuff. And if you want to, like, say, for instance, go to Newgrounds and submit your work, that would be one of the reasons why you'd want to use an SWF. However, today, with places like YouTube and all that kind of stuff, I find video is a better alternative, especially since YouTube can be viewed on all devices. For instance, Flash can't be viewed on iOS devices, an iPad, iPhone. So if you have an SWF, you're kind of cutting out some of your audience, especially since things are going more mobile these days. So if that was my recommendation, is if you're going to like a place like Newgrounds, by all means, do go the SWF route. If you're trying to get more of a wider audience, I would stick with video. But again, that's just my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Can you provide a rule of thumb regarding file size relative to frame count? So for instance, the question is, would 1,000 frames equal to about 10 megabytes or so?
That's actually a good question. I'm not sure. It's kind of hard because, again, it depends on the effects you have in your video. So for instance, that video I had with the character just walking that I brought into Premiere is about 35 meg. The one with the UFO you saw is about 7 meg. And really, that animation of the character walking is only 5 seconds long, and that was 35. Now, that has a lot to do with the animation codec. If you would like a smaller file size, I would definitely recommend you look at the H.264 codec. Again, it washes your colors out a little bit, but if you're kind of short on file space on your hard drive, that might be the way to go for you.
Sometimes the animation is also dependent on, or the animation file size is dependent on what sort of objects you import. If you have a 3D object, or if you have a very large file that you've imported, such as an image or a PSD, then obviously that will increase the size of the animation as well.
Yes, and like different effects, like the blur effects and all that kind of stuff, can really bump it up as well, because it's different colors it has to render and everything. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. So there's a question about how many frames you can animate, and I'll answer that. So on Anime Studio Debut, you can animate up to 3,000 frames, and in Anime Studio Pro, obviously, you can animate to your heart's content. It's unlimited. Mm-hmm. The second question that's sort of related to that is, does Anime Studio Pro 6 do the same thing as what you've shown in Anime Studio Pro 8 right now? And I believe so. I believe all the features that Chad has gone through is basically available in Anime Studio 6 as well. So the next question is, I use the Grass Valley editing system. Do you advise that I render in H-264?
What? I'm sorry. Could he? What editing system is he using?
Grass Valley editing.
I
That
don't think I've heard.
That may be a very particular editing system.
Yeah. You know, when it comes to, I'll just say this. H.264 is a very safe file format, mainly because many computers can view it, many devices can view it, and it seems to be very editor-friendly nowadays. Premiere can bring it in. The only thing you might have problems with is if you're, of course, using Windows Movie Maker. I don't think that program brings in QuickTime files. So I should have probably actually made a note of that when I was doing all this. But H.264 is a pretty safe file format, I would say, for most things.
So a follow-up to that question is the EDS editing system. I don't know if that makes any clarification of the question, but if it does, please feel free to comment. If it doesn't, we'll just move on to the next question.
The ED, you said?
EDIUS, E-D-I-U-S editing system.
Yeah, I don't think I've heard of that one, unfortunately. So kind of stick with my Premiere and all that. So I'm yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. Thank you. The next question is for folks that have missed webinars. We definitely have posted all of the webinars on our website. You can actually check it out at anime.smithmicro.com/webinars. We'll actually put up a slide on that as well. And the next question is, have you ever used Anime Studio for game applications?
I have not myself, but I'm sure you definitely could. I mean, especially with the drawing tools and all that. I mean, I'm sure you could even creating the art assets in Anime Studio would be beneficial, I would say. Especially since you can export them out as SWF files. You could perhaps bring that in then to another program, because SWF is pretty universal when it comes to like interactive type of elements. And you could probably bring those in and, do some game design. So I myself don't do a lot. I haven't done game design. So. Okay.
The next question is, have you ever used Final Cut instead of Premiere?
I have. I have two computers here. I have a laptop that is a Mac, and I have my PC, obviously, that you're seeing right now. I like both, and I say I prefer Premiere, but really, I mean, Final Cut is awesome. I haven't tried the new version. I heard there was some issues with that, but Final Cut and Premiere are actually very similar in how they operate, and so I do like both. And yes, I would recommend both of those, Premiere and Final Cut.
The other question that I have is, would you consider Anime Studio to be a standard tool for animators?
I would definitely recommend, and that's just the thing. When it comes to different tools and all that, I think it really comes down to the ability of the user. I definitely think that Anime Studio ranks up there as far as standard tools, as far as, using, I mean, when it comes to, I mean, you can, if you just look out there, there's some very, very awesome looking stuff made in Anime Studio, and people will always make the argument, oh, Toon Boom and Flash, they're the king of animation, but really, I think if you just have the drive and you know your tools, you can basically create anything in Anime Studio that you could create in those programs. And so that's my take on it. I think it just, as long as you're comfortable with your tools, I think you can really go far with it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how many frames can you put in a minute?
In a minute? Well, first of all, it would probably depend on your frame rate. And I think I discussed this in another question. I probably should have touched on it more, actually, in the lesson. But if you go to your project settings, you'll see that the default is 24 frames per second. And that's what I used for this project. That means for every second, you're going to have 24 frames of animation. So if you, I guess, multiply that by, what, 60? You would probably figure that out. But I can just scroll over here really quick. And I went too far. We're about, let me get this out of the way. So in order to get 24 frames per second to get a minute of animation, you're looking at 1,440 frames. So.
Okay, thank you. The next question is regarding Anime Studio having difficulty managing your project. The question is, does it ever crash on you?
You know, it's kind of funny. When I actually have, that was one of the things, my personal experience. Of course, there might be someone else out there who is, screaming, no, it crashes all the time, which I never have experienced those problems. I actually went from Flash to Anime Studio just when I started playing, and I always found like programs like Flash to crash more than Anime Studio, probably because programs like Flash have more stuff to them. You have the interactive elements, you have all this and that. It's not just animation. The good thing about Anime Studio is, since it's so focused on animation, you get just the tools you need. And I think there's less stuff that can go wrong in the background. That's my take on it. And so I don't even remember if Anime Studio's ever crashed on me. I can't think of a time it has. With that said, though, just make sure you save often, because computers in general are not foolproof. So.
Correct. The good news on that, and if I may extend a little bit on that, is that the Anime Studio does have an auto-save feature, so when a crash does occur, it does save your work. But like Chad said, it's always wise to save often. It's better to be, okay than sorry, I suppose, if that ever happens. Sometimes, whether it's Anime Studio, or Flash, or any other program, when the computer resources are maximized, obviously, a crash will occur, and that applies to almost every program out there. So it really depends on your computer, the files that you're using, and what you're importing. But it should be rare. It shouldn't happen on a continuous basis. The next question is, have you ever done Lua scripts?
Have I ever done sorry, what was the question again?
Have you ever done any scripting in Anime Studio?
Oh, scripting, yeah. I personally, as far as creating scripts, I actually haven't. I haven't done a lot of that, but I do use scripts every now and then. I'll come up here, and I especially like the particle effects, like the rain and the smoke. I've definitely used those a lot in my own cartoons. As far as creating them, I haven't really touched on that aspect of it, mainly because everything I need is kind of right there, and so I haven't had a need to yet. But as far as using them, I use them. As far as creating, no, I haven't created any.
There is a webinar that touches on scripting, so at the end of this webinar, we'll post up the link so that everyone can go and check it out. It's basically specific to scripting, so you guys can check that out to get a little bit more information on that. So the next question is, do you create a new animation file for every scene, or do you try to animate several scenes in one file?
Well, I like to create separate files, and that's just my personal preference. You could definitely create an extended scene in a project file if you wish. The reason why I do separate files is because it helps me organize it a bit better. It's better for me to have to go back and edit a little chunk versus like a 10,000 frame animation, having to sift through it and be like, oh geez, where did that one part go? That I need to edit. That's just my personal take on it. But again, I'm sure there's other people out there who say there's benefits to using the extended project files and creating everything in there. Probably because you have all your assets there. You don't have to keep importing and stuff. I could see that as being one advantage. But I do separate project files when that comes to my work.
So the next question is, have you ever saved your Anime Studio files on a portable memory disk?
On a portable memory disk? You mean I'm assuming like a USB drive?
That's correct.
Yeah, I mean you can do that, especially if you're collaborating. I would say that's something you can do. The thing about the project files themselves is they're usually relatively small. It depends on what you put into it. Of course, if you import like videos and all these big images, you're going to have bigger project files, so you might not be able to fit it onto a smaller USB drive. But like something like this, like the animation I just did, if I actually go and look, I mean, like my character animation is, it's 188K. The actual animation was not even a meg. So, you probably could easily do that. It just depends on, you just got to be careful of what you're putting into your project file so you have enough space.
Okay, thank you. I just want to mention to all the participants that, we're close to wrapping up. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to ask in the Q&A window. We'll continue taking more questions, and I have a few myself that I'd like to get answered. But before I do that, I'll ask some of the questions that have just come in. Have you ever used the shadowing functionality or tools within Anime Studio?
I have. I know I think there's a couple different ones, if I remember right. I'm in my layer effects right now. You can do shadows right here. Like for instance, this shadow will kind of put like a drop shadow onto the character. The shading we kind of covered that in lesson 2. I was talking about the style effects. It's actually really similar. This will just pretty much put a shade effect on the character. I can just put it on there really quick. And then the perspective shadow is more kind of like a 3D shadow effect. We'll just try these really quick, and I can just render it out. You can see that there's a shade effect on his face, but also we have the drop shadow. So, I mean, those are really easy to implement. Of course, I wouldn't use the drop shadow for something like this. This shade could be used for this environment, but since it's like an outside environment, there's no wall there. You probably wouldn't have the drop shadow in this instance. But yes, I do use those in my own work a lot, actually.
Have you ever used physics in your animations?
I'm trying to think of a time I've used them, and I don't think I have anything at the top of my head that I've done recently. I have used the physics, and I think they're really cool. I just haven't gotten to a point yet where I've used them in my own work, but I actually have a tutorial on how to use them. So I have used them. I think they're really cool, and I definitely plan to use them. I just haven't had a cartoon yet that needed to implement them yet.
That's great, actually. You know what? That brings up potential for another webinar on physics. So that's great. And another great question by the participant. So Michi just mentioned that we do have a webinar on physics. So please check it out when you guys get a chance. So I have a couple questions of my own. Maybe you could get into them and explain a little bit more about switch layers.
Yes. Yeah, the switch layer thing was kind of an accident, and I kind of apologize for going through it not as slowly as I could have. But okay, I will do just a quick demonstration on how a switch layer can be useful. I use the eye blinking thing as an example. I'll just do that again. So I'm zooming in on my eyes, and I'm simply going to create a switch layer, which is, of course, kind of what I showed you. It houses different vector layers. So I'll just go to New Layer, and I'll choose Switch. And I'll just name this Eyes Switch. And I'll bring it close to where my eyes are right there. So now I'm going to bring the eyes vector into that switch layer. So those are now below those. I'm now going to make a new vector layer under the switch. And I'll name this Eyes Closed. And actually, what I can do here very easily, I'm just going to copy these circles over to that layer. So you'll notice whenever you click on one of the vector layers underneath a switch layer, that the current one disappears. You're just viewing the one that you're currently selected on. That's part of kind of how the switch layers work. But for the eyes closed, I'll just kind of shrink them like this. I'll take my skin color. Let's kind of go like that. And I'm doing this really quickly, but I'm just going to put a line through them like this. Oops. And then let's go like that. So we have the lines for the eyes closed. And so we have the eyes open and we have the eyes closed under the switch layer. Really quick, I won't get into that. You could also do one for the pupils and make one for the pupils visible and one for the pupils invisible. But I'll just hide those for right now. So you can see now, like let's say I'm walking along. Oh, maybe that's another thing you want to do too, is when you're doing these type of things, you want to make sure that the switch layer is also on one of the bones. So I'll just bind it to the bone really quick. But when he's walking, his eyes are closed, and all of a sudden he wants them to open. So you would right-click on that switch layer and choose Eyes Open, And you can see now that there is a switch layer keyframe on your timeline. So you can go from close to open, and you could do all sorts of switch layers that way. And you could just, like for instance, I would probably have a switcher for the pupils then, for one where the pupils are invisible, one for when they're visible. So I could switch those along with the eye open and close animation. And you can do that for mouth animations. You can do it for anything if you want. You could do it for, like, let's say if you have different angles of a character, you could have that switch layer switch if you want to go from a profile to a mug shot to an angle shot and so on. And again, I explain it a lot better in my tutorials that I have on these things. So if you go to my website, you'll definitely find much more in-depth explanations on it.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question regarding if physics would help more with action scenes.
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, I love it. I love blowing stuff up. I love seeing stuff blow up. So that would definitely be cool. I mean, if you had something crashing or blowing up, yeah, definitely. You have all that, the physics going on. I think that'd be really cool, actually.
Okay, perfect. And then the last question we'll take for participants here says, asks, can you use actions to control switch layers?
Can you use actions to control switch layers? You know, I'm actually not 100% sure. I know that actions are more used for bone animation. I've actually never looked into the switch layer aspect. Essentially, what you can do you know the question? Do you know the answer to that? I actually am not 100% sure on that one.
That one is something that I would have to get back on the user, and I can definitely post the answer to that question on Facebook.
Okay, yeah, I know. I mean, I know for bone animation and all that, definitely. I'm not sure about switch layers though.
Okay, well, we'll get back to the participant on that particular question. My last question to you is regarding audio. If you wanted to just lightly touch on audio for you know, character and such, and then afterwards we'll wrap it up.
Yes. Again, I didn't get into audio with this. I probably should have gotten into audio a little bit more, I guess, now I look at this. But first of all, importing audio is very easy. You can go to File, Import, and you can choose audio file. Just to go to your computer, and you can search for an audio file. It's very similar to the image or the Anime Studio object. You just search for it and you bring it in. In this case, I think I'm just going to bring in something here that's just like this. Just that's already in the content library. So now, you'll notice that I have a layer for that audio file. And when I'm selected on that layer, or even when I'm not selected on that layer, you can see that you have that WAV file or appear on your timeline. So you can kind of see how it plays out. And even though I have my headset on so you can't hear what's going on, but you can, as you scrub it, you can hear it. And so what's good about this, I would say, when it comes to audio files, and this is what I do, is whenever I bring in a voice, like a character's voice, I'll scrub through and I'll go through each frame. And I have a tutorial on this as well where I kind of touch on this. But I'll go into my switch layer, my mouth switch layer, and I'll choose, oh, that's an open mouth instance. Okay, I'll switch it to that. You know, okay, this is a closed mouth. This is a, you know, and you just kind of piece it together like that. There is an automatic way to open and close the mouth depending on the voice in Anime Studio. I think it's actually an extension you can download. But I think there's also like a very basic form of that in Anime Studio. Basically, you have your switch layer set up a certain way, and they will open and shut depending on how loud I think the sound effect is at that particular point on the timeline. But essentially, you can just bring in audio files like that, and you can import them at certain points. Like say, like I want an audio file at frame 2. I could just import another audio file, and again, I'll just use one of these. And you can see now, this red indicates that it doesn't appear there, but it starts here. And you can kind of just piece it together that way. And if need be, when it comes to audio files, you sometimes have to go to the sequencer, and you might have to adjust them like that. Like you have the whistle start at frame 1, but maybe you want it at frame 12, so you can bring it up like that. But anyway, is there anything particular you want me to touch on, or is that a kind of a good enough explanation?
I think that's a great explanation for the time being. It's almost as though we probably need a webinar dedicated just to bringing in audio and lip syncing and all that. And I think that would be a great learning experience for all the participants for that particular feature set. So with that, I'm going to ask Michi to pass control of the webinar to myself. So the first thing I wanted to say was thank you to all the participants for attending. We appreciate you being part of these 4 webinars with us over the last 4 weeks. And at the same time, I wanted to thank you, Chad, for all the time and the effort that you put into this. I'm sure it was a great deal of work, and at the same time, everyone really benefited from it, including myself. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just to let everyone know, this webinar was recorded and will be posted on our website. So you can go to my.smithmicro.com/webinars. You can get more information on Anime Studio by going to anime.smithmicro.com. And as well, please feel free to check out Chad's incredible tutorials, literally at incredibletutorials.com, and check out his Steve and the Alien series, where he goes into more in-depth features of Anime Studio. It's an 11.5-hour tutorial series. So I would definitely go check it out. At the same time, when you guys get a moment, please make sure to like us on Anime Studio and follow us on Twitter. The next slide actually is about our email list. So if you get a chance, if you're not on our email list, please make sure to join that email list. The link is right up there for you to visit. And then at the same time, if you are a student or an educator, please check out our campus pricing, and the link is available for you guys there as well. On behalf of myself and Michi and the rest of Smith Micro, we wanted to thank you for all your time in this webinar series, and we look forward to seeing you with our future webinars. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.